And we've been working our way through Mark's Gospel, and we're at chapter 7. And Cynthia read so well for us, and thank you to her for that. And what I want to talk about, Vincent, could we put the title, not the title, the text up on the screen so that people can look at it? You know the way the Bible text can go up there. Thank you, Vincent. So what we're looking at here is a hearing from heaven. So this is a rich passage. It's a really exciting passage. I've really been blessed studying it. One of the things that you find when you work through Mark's Gospel is the immense kindness of Jesus. We're going to see that kindness this morning. But also Mark wants us to always be asking the question, who is this person? Who is this person who turns up and what's he doing? Who is he? It's right at the heart of Mark's Gospel. It's the question you should ask whenever you look at Mark's Gospel. Who is this? Well, let's just think about Jesus for a moment. There was an advertisement in an English newspaper that went something like this. He was born in an obscure village, the child of peasant women. He grew up in another village, working in a carpenter's shop until he was 30. For 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family. He never traveled more than 200 miles from where he was born. He did none of those things that we normally associate with greatness. He had no credentials but his self. When he was 33, the tide of public opinion turned against him. He was turned over to his enemies. He faced a mock trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. And while he was dying, the executioners divided out his clothing, which was actually the only possessions that he owned. He died and was put in a borrowed grave that was given to him by the pity of a friend. And yet 19 centuries have come and gone, and he is still the central figure of human history. All the armies that ever marched, all the nations or the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, not together have affected the life of men and women on this earth as much as this solitary figure. So think about it. Jesus is unique in history, but who is he? And can we know him? Can he be personal to us? This person, we divide our calendar into before Christ and after Christ. This central picture of the whole of history, can we know him personally for ourselves? And what is he like? And who is he? Well, as I've told you already, Mark's Gospel focuses on the issue of who is Jesus. And I'm going to tell you 3 things about who Jesus is. First of all, he is a kind friend. He's a kind friend, and he offers to be each of our kind friends. Second of all, he has come to restore what's broken in this world. Look around in this world, and there are things that are broken. Look into your own life. There are things that are broken. There's pain that we have all faced. There's brokenness in this world. He has come to restore that. And then he calls us to both listen and speak. So 3 things about him. He offers to be your kind friend. He restores that which is broken in the world. And he is the one who calls you to listen and to speak. So he's a kind friend. Well, there was a Church of England, an Anglican minister in England, and he was doing door-to-door work in his collar, those clerical collars. And he walked up this manicured lawn of a large house, and he knocked on the door, and a man opened and looked at him in his collar, saw that he was probably wanting to talk about God. And the man said to him, he said, "I'm not interested in God." To which this gutsy minister said, "That really doesn't matter, because I'm here to tell you that God is interested in you." And he is. He comes today as our kind friend. And here's Jesus, and he's in this area around the region of the Decapolis. Decapolis literally means the 10 Apolis, metropolitus or whatever, is city. So the 10 cities. He's in a region around the 10 cities. It's a Gentile area. That means it's a non-Jewish area. He's reaching out to people who weren't like him. And it's interesting because he's been in this area before. Back in chapter 5, do you remember there was a man who had a multitude of demons possessing him? He was referred to as Legion. And it was in that area that Jesus freed this man. But when Jesus cast those demons into a pig, or a bunch of pigs, a herd of pigs, they all went off a cliff and died. So the people thought, well, actually, you know what? This Jesus disturbs things. So they pleaded with him to go away. And yet the funny thing is that Jesus comes back to this area. He's not finished reaching out in love to these people. He hasn't given up on them. Not yet. He hasn't given up on you. He comes to us and he persists in his love for us. And there was that man who had the demons, and when he was freed, he was just so excited about who Jesus is, and he's pleaded with him. While they pleaded, go away, he pleaded, let me come with you. And what happens is Jesus says, no, what I want you to do is I want you to go around your home area. I want you to talk to your people, and I want you to tell them about the goodness, the kindness that God has shared to you. And I kind of wonder if when Jesus came back in here, did that man know, that Jesus was back in town? I wonder also whether the fact that this deaf man's friends that we read of here, whether it might have been through that man referred to as Legion, that they knew he was kind. And these people, some people there, they hear of the kindness of Jesus, and they bring him their friend who is deaf. And then there's more kindness to Jesus, because Jesus didn't make this man sort of some trophy to show what he's doing. He brings this man aside. And it's almost, because what happens in these verses, I don't know when Cynthia was reading if you saw how unusual this is. Jesus puts his fingers in his ears and spits and puts his saliva on his mouth. It's both beautiful and intimate, but it's also a bit weird. But I think what's happening is that Jesus is speaking to a man who can't hear with sign language. He's coming to this man and meeting him where he's at. There's even, I thought that the commentators were probably pushing it a bit too far, but that word that Cynthia pronounced so well, apaphata? Well done, you see. I can't do that sort of thing, but one commentator even said that, that's a very, you got to use your mouth. It would have been easy for them to see what's going on. I'm not sure. I think that's probably a bit too much. But Jesus is speaking to him in sign language. I'm going to unblock your ears. I'm going to loosen your tongue. And then he looks to heaven. This is going to be the work of God. And the man hears, and now the man can speak. And one of the things that you find when you look at Mark's gospel is that Jesus is immensely compassionate. It's just driven home the whole time. It's one of Mark's central themes. And then the second point is that Jesus is restoring creation. And this is where I'm glad the room is a little bit sort of colder, because when rooms get warm, people get sleepy, and when people get sleepy, they stop to concentrate. So this is the perfect temperature for me to speak to you. But here, just concentrate with a moment. Notice what Jesus does before he heals the man. He sighs deeply. He sighs deeply, and there's something going on here, because Mark doesn't record things like this very often. Jesus' expressions. So why did Mark include that? Well, it seems to be, and I think of Romans chapter 8, where it says that the whole of creation sighs. And I think what it's doing is that he's saying there's something broken. He's engaging with the suffering of a broken world. You see, what we're told in the Bible is that in the beginning, God created a world where there wasn't supposed to be death and suffering and brokenness and tears and pain. But humankind decided they didn't want to live under God's loving rule. And the hard thing is that God's judgment on that was that now we do live in a world with death and deafness. I point to my deaf ear. By the way, I'm deaf in this ear. So if I ever ignore you, if you're speaking into that one, it's not my fault. But where there are things of brokenness that we all suffer, we all face the prospect of our own death. It's hard. And I think that Jesus looks at this brokenness that he sees in this man who can't speak clearly and who can't hear. And he sees that this is evidence that the world is not the way the world was supposed to be. And he sighs with the pain of it. And then what does he do? He heals the man. And now the man can speak. And it's like there's a recreating. And then I wouldn't have known this except that I looked this up in a commentary. But if you look at verse 37, in verse 37 it says, the people were overwhelmed with amazement. And look at these words, he has done everything well. Now in those days there was a Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. And if you were to go to the Septuagint, which Mark, who's writing this down, would have known, those are the same words you read in the Genesis account of creation, where it says that God looked at everything and saw that it was good. And I think that Mark is bringing your attention to the fact that here is Jesus, and he's coming and he's restoring creation. He's rebuilding, he's restoring what's broken. And there's good news in this and there's bad news in this. The good news is that God does do that. That we believe in a God who answers prayers and brings healing. But the bad news is that there's a waiting. Because all of us, we're not promised that in this world things will be easy. We know that in this world it continues to be a world of death and pain and suffering, and we suffer. But he's coming again. This is a foretaste. This is a taster. This is a pointing ahead. He's saying, this is what I'm doing sometimes now, but when I come, I'll do the whole thing. There will come a day where there'll be a new heaven and a new earth when I return, says Jesus, and there will be no more pain. There'll be no more sorrow. There'll be no more deafness. There'll be no more tears. And so in this passage, we're getting a hint. Here's the one who comes and restores creation. And then the third thing to say about this thing is that we're called to speak and to hear. You might notice that across this passage, Jesus uses hearing and speaking in what we might call metaphorical ways. He says, he who has ears, let him hear. Because the world is deaf to his love. And he's saying, I'm speaking to you. I want you to hear my love. I want you to take this on board. And then when you take this on board, I want you to speak. And remember, what was the central question with Mark's Gospel, Matt? Who is Jesus? Okay? I won't pick on anyone else like that. Okay? Who is Jesus? Well, if you flick back to Isaiah in the Old Testament, written hundreds of years before this, I'll just read some verses. Isaiah chapter 35, verse 4 and 5. Say to the faithful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. And then it's verse 5. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened. This is when your God comes. And the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. Then the lame will leap like the joy, and the mute tongue shout for joy. That's what's happening here. So Jesus is saying, I've come. I've come. I'm the one that was promised of in the Old Testament. When your God comes, that one has come. I'm him. The promised king of the Old Testament, I've come. And this is a sign that I've come. I'm doing the things that he'll do, opening the ears and enabling people to speak. And that's why I asked for "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues" to sing when I was in a Methodist church growing up in Cork. We sang that hymn loads of times. I didn't know the story of that hymn until this week. It's written by Charles Wesley, an English hymn writer, brother to the famous evangelist John Wesley. And Charles Wesley was talking to a friend of his, a guy called Peter Bohr. And Peter Bohr said to him, it was a year after his conversion to following Jesus, Peter Bohr said to him, you know, if I had 1,000 tongues, I'd use every single one of them to praise Jesus. And that's what happens here. Oh, for 1,000. I think it's the second verse. Hear him, ye deaf, ye praise his dumb. Your loosened tongues employ. Sometimes God does come now and heal the deaf, but he is coming, and that's a first fruit. That's a taster of what will come when he comes, the end of time. And where for those who have put their trust in him, there will be no more death, nor pain, nor mourning. And I do have to warn you that for those who have rejected his love, there will be the judgment that their sins deserve. And how do you know which side you'll be on? Simply by putting your trust in Jesus, by turning to him as your kind friend. And he offers that to each one of us. Let's finish. I read this really good book, by the way, it's coming up to Christmas time. Good thing to buy books. You're running out of time, though. So you need to be getting your books. One book that I'd love